So during the last video, this is the third video, during the last video, we talked about the actual anatomy of the respiratory system, and now we're going to talk about breathing itself. So in pulmonary ventilation, or breathing, consists of a repetitive cycle of inspiration, which is inhaling, and expiration, or exhaling. The respiratory cycle is one complete inspiration and expiration. You can have quiet respiration, which occurs at rest, is effortless, and is automatic. Or you can have forced respiration, which is deep, rapid breathing, such as during exercise. So the flow in and out of the lung depends on a pressure difference between the air within the lungs and the pressure outside of the body. The respiratory muscles are able to change lung volumes and create these pressure differences relative to the atmosphere. So with the respiratory muscles, the first is going to be the diaphragm, which is the prime mover of respiration. So contraction will flatten the diaphragm, allowing the thoracic cavity to expand and pulling air into the lungs. Relaxation allows the diaphragm to bulge upward again, compressing the lungs and expelling the air. And this accounts for 2/3 of airflow. So the diaphragm is a pretty important part of breathing. So in addition to the diaphragm, there are also internal and external intercostal muscles, which are within the ribs. And these act as synergists to the diaphragm, so they work with the diaphragm. These are located between the ribs, and they stiffen the thoracic cage during respiration. This prevents it from caving inwards when the diaphragm descends, and contribute to the enlargement and the contraction of the thoracic cage. About 1/3 of the air that's ventilated into the lungs is because of these intercostal muscles. There are also scalenes, which act as synergists to the diaphragm, and they can fix or elevate the first and second ribs. In addition, there are also accessory muscles of respiration that act usually in forced respiration. And these can be things such as the erector spinae, the abdominal muscles, things that you would notice while you're forcing that inspiration. I'm not going to ask you to remember each of them, but do know the difference between forced and inspiration while you're at rest. So this forced inspiration greatly increases the thoracic volume using those accessory muscles of the thorax and sometimes the abdominal muscles. So during normal quiet expiration, it's an energy-saving passive process that's achieved by the elasticity of the lungs and the elasticity of the thoracic cage. So as the muscles relax, the structures recoil to the original shape and making the thoracic cavity smaller, resulting in airflow out of the lungs. In forced expiration, this is when those accessory muscles come into play. Again, these are the rectus abdominis, other lumbar, abdominal, pelvic muscles, the erector spinae, things like that. And this increases abdominal pressure as it pushes the viscera up against the diaphragm, increasing the thoracic pressure, therefore forcing the air out. And this is important for abdominal breathing. So for neural control of breathing, this differs from the neural control of other basic functions, such as your heartbeat. So there's no autorhythmic pacemaker cells like in the heart for respiration. And we don't really know the exact mechanism for setting the rhythm of respiration. Breathing depends on the repetitive stimulation of skeletal muscles from the brain and will definitely cease if the spinal cord is severed too high in the neck. So these skeletal muscles require nervous stimulation, and the interaction of multiple respiratory muscles requires the coordination. So this is why a spinal cord injury could be pretty fatal. So the brainstem respiratory centers. This is an automatic, unconscious cycle of breathing and is controlled by 3 pairs of respiratory centers in the reticular formation of the medulla oblongata as well as the pons. The respiratory network in the medulla is broken into 2 groups. This is the ventral respiratory group and the dorsal respiratory group. The ventral respiratory group is the primary generator of the respiratory rhythm, and during quiet breathing, inspiratory neurons fire about 2 seconds. Expiratory neurons during quiet breathing fire for about 3 seconds, which allow the inspiratory muscles to relax. And this produces a normal respiratory rhythm of about 12 breaths per minute. The dorsal respiratory group then modifies the rate and depth of breathing and receives influences from external surfaces. So the ventral respiratory group is the primary generator and is involved in normal breathing, whereas the dorsal respiratory group can then modify what's going on with the ventral respiratory group. The pons also contains the pontine respiratory group, which modifies the rhythm of the VRG by outputs to both the VRG and the DRG, and this adapts breathing to special circumstances such as sleep, exercise, vocalization, and emotional responses. So here we can see the relatedness of the respiratory control centers. Here we have inputs to the centers of the medulla, there, and within the pons. So we have the pontine respiratory group occurring right here within the pons, the dorsal respiratory group here, and the ventral respiratory group right here within the medulla oblongata. These then go to spinal integrating centers, which project to the nerves that drive inspiration, using the intercostal nerves and the phrenic nerve. So hyperventilation is an anxiety-triggered state in which breathing is so rapid that it expels carbon dioxide faster from the body, faster than it is produced. So as the blood carbon dioxide levels drop, the pH will then rise, causing cerebral arteries to constrict. This reduces cerebral perfusion, or the amount of blood within the brain, which then can cause dizziness or fainting. It could be brought into control by having that person, if you've seen this on TV shows or done it yourself, having them rebreathe that expired carbon dioxide from a paper bag. So we generally think of carbon dioxide as being bad for the body, but we really do need carbon dioxide in a certain amount. So central chemoreceptors are brainstem neurons that respond to changes in the pH of cerebrospinal fluid, which would reflect the level of carbon dioxide within the blood. So they're able to regulate respiration to maintain a stable pH so that the respiratory center ensures stable carbon dioxide levels in the blood. There are also peripheral chemoreceptors, which are located in the carotid and aortic bodies of large arteries above the heart. And this responds to both carbon dioxide and oxygen content, as well as the pH of the blood. So in addition to those receptors, there are also stretch receptors that are found within the smooth muscles of bronchi and bronchioles and in the visceral pleura. And this responds to the inflation of the lungs. So inflation, or the Herring-Brewer reflex, is triggered by excessive inflation. So this is a protective reflex that inhibits inspiratory neurons and stops inspiration. Irritant receptors are nerve endings that are in the epithelial cells of the airway, and this responds to smoke, dust, pollen, chemicals, cold air, excess mucus, basically anything that makes you cough. This triggers protective reflexes such as bronchoconstriction, shallower breathing, breath holding, or coughing. So here we have our peripheral chemoreceptors that are located within the common carotid and the aortic bodies. They send nerves using the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve. So during voluntary control over breathing, that originates in the motor cortex of the frontal lobe of the brain. And this sends impulses down the corticospinal tracts to the respiratory neurons within the spinal cord and bypasses the brainstem, where the very basic breathing originates. And there are limits to voluntary control. So the breaking point is when carbon dioxide levels rise to a point where automatic controls will then override people's will. So you can't always voluntarily breathe as you would like so that you can protect your body. So much like the heart, pressure, resistance, and airflow play a large role in determining airflow. So respiratory airflow is governed by the same principles of flow, pressure, and resistance in blood. So the flow of a fluid is directly proportional to the pressure difference between the 2 points and is inversely proportional to the resistance. Again, just like blood. So atmospheric pressure drives respiration. Atmospheric pressure is the weight of the air around us. And this is 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level, or it's called 1 atmosphere. And this is lower at higher elevations. So with Boyle's law, this states that at a constant temperature, the pressure of a given quantity of gas is inversely proportional to the volume. So this means that if the lungs contain a quantity of gas and the lung volume increases, the internal pressure, also known as the intrapulmonary pressure, will then fall. If that pressure falls below the atmospheric pressure, air will then move into the lungs with inspiration. When the lung volume decreases, the intrapulmonary pressure is going to rise. If the pressure rises above atmospheric pressure, air moves out of the lungs. While you're learning this, try to think about respiration, and I would definitely reread this slide while you're breathing. So inspire and then expire and think about what's going on. So the unit for pressure used by respiratory physiologists is centimeters of water. This measures how far a column of water would be moved by that given pressure. This is because it's more sensitive than millimeters of mercury, since mercury is a pretty heavy liquid, and it wouldn't be very good to measure the pressure in the body. So with inspiration, the intrapleural pressure is the slightly negative pressure that exists between the 2 pleural layers. The recoil of lung tissue and tissues of the thoracic cage causes lungs and chest wall to pull in opposite directions. So the small space between the parietal and visceral pleura is filled with the fluid, and these layers stay together. So about -5 centimeters of water of intrapleural pressure results. So definitely keep in mind that intrapleural pressure plays a large role in respiration. So these 2 pleural layers cling together because of the cohesion of water. So when the ribs swing upward and outward during inspiration, the parietal pleura follows them. The visceral pleura, on the other hand, clings to them because of the cohesion of water and follows the pleura. This allows for the stretching of the alveoli within the lungs. This means that the entire lung will expand along with the thoracic cage, and as it increases in volume, the internal pressure drops and air flows in. So another force that expands the lungs is explained by Charles's law, which means that the volume of gas is directly proportional to the absolute temperature. So on a cold day, air will increase its temperature during inspiration. This inhaled air is warmed to 37 degrees Celsius by the time it reaches the alveoli. This means that the inhaled volume of 500 milliliters will expand to 536 milliliters, and this thermal expansion contributes to the inflation of the lungs further. During quiet breathing, the dimensions of the thoracic cage increase only a couple of millimeters each direction, but this is enough to increase the total volume by about 500 milliliters. So about 500 milliliters of air flows into the respiratory tract. So here we see the respiratory cycle, where looking at how the ribs play a large role in it. We'll continue the next lecture by looking at expiration.